Chapter 49 of The Peril Finders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeana Way. The Peril Finders by George Fenn. Chapter 49. Griggs is stubborn. The days glided by, with the stiffness in Chrisley's limbs growing less painful, and the pony recovering fast, for the clear mountain air seemed to act like a cure for wounds. Every day that came showed the injured animal in better condition. Its efforts to move no longer made Chris wince and forget his own pains in those he felt at seeing the mustang suffer. Everyone was busy, for the keeping watch regularly took up a good deal of time. Then shooting had to be attended to, so as to keep up a good supply of fresh meat, till the birds upon which the party depended grew shy of coming to the spring, and 2 or 3 anxious discussions had been held about supplies for the future, the result of which was that a decision had been arrived at, for the departure to be made as soon as possible. Chris was quite strong enough, so he declared, "Pooh!" and at last every hour seemed to make an improvement in the mustang. "It's all nonsense, Ned," cried Chris, "for them to think that they're staying on account of us. Hullo, Griggs! Were you listening?" "Nay, I was close here, and your chatter came rattling into my ears like peas. We're not waiting for you now. How did your pony go this morning?" "Splendid. Just halted a little on the bad leg, but it's better than it was yesterday." "Did you canter this morning?" "Canter? We went at a good swinging gallop." "And what about you?" "Oh, I'm only a little stiff still. Here, I want for us to be off. We shall get strong more quickly journeying over the plains or climbing in and out among the mountains. I don't like to bother my father any more. But what does he say?" "He says we're to start tomorrow at daybreak." "Hurrah!" cried Chris. "But we shan't, my lad." "Why not?" "Because I've seen Indians again." "Oh, you're always seeing Indians again. Here it has been one day, and you declare that they were gone. And then the very next day you've seen them again." "Well, they showed themselves to me. I didn't want them," said Griggs dryly. "They're an artful lot. Never been away at all, I believe. We couldn't see 'em, but if we made a start they had been close upon our heels directly." "Ah, you have to trap them, Chris," said Ned maliciously. "Look here, if you say that again, we shall quarrel. Hear that, Griggs?" "Oh, yes, I hear. Serve you right. Why don't you drop all that teasing? If you can't show us a better way, you had better hold your tongue." "Very well, I can do that," said Ned haughtily. "There, that's enough," cried Chris. "Don't be so petty, Ned. We've got something else to think about besides teasing and bantering." "That's right," cried Griggs. "Look here, lads, I've just been trying that place again. I started from the mouth of the valley, and ran in and out among the rocks and trees, got to the foot of the way up quickly, and then acted just as if I had the Indians after me. I've no doubt about it now. Once I could get them after me, I could lead them a pretty race, and dodge in and out till I reached the path up to the terrace, over the way, scuttle up, and let down stones enough to stop them from coming after me, so that I don't believe they could clear the way for a week." "Then you're ready to try it any time?" "Any time the doctor likes." "But what about the arrows?" said Ned. "I'm not afraid of them hitting me, my lad," said Griggs confidently. "Being shot at by fellows with bows and arrows sounds bad enough, but there's not much risk here." "I don't know about that," said Chris anxiously. "Don't you? Well, I do. I should be running fast and dodging in and out among the rocks and trees. That would make it hard shooting for a man standing still, wouldn't it?" "Yes, of course," said Chris, with a dubious look all the same. "But the enemy won't be standing still," continued Griggs. "They'll be galloping after me as hard as they can come. Not that it'll be very fast, for mounted men can't get along very well among rocks and trees. What's more, they can't shoot straight with their ponies cantering. I don't believe there's a bit of risk for me. I shall be all right. What I'm afraid of is that when I come alone through the narrows with the whole herd full pelt after me, some of the mules and ponies will squeal or neigh and make the enemy suspicious. If they do hear anything, we're done." "But our animals will be well back in that hollow," said Chris. "Yes, my lad, but I want them to be planted further back still. There's a bit I've been looking out quite a quarter of a mile further off, and I'm going to propose it to the doctor as being safest. I'm afraid father will say that the ponies ought to be close at hand." "Yes, that's right if it can be done. but it would go hard with us all if the Indians gave up the bait of the trap and turned upon those who set it. We mustn't run risks, but there's a way of doing things more safely." "Well, you must talk it over with father," said Chris. "Let's see, we're going to have another look at the place this afternoon, aren't we?" "We were," replied the American, "but we're not going now." "Why?" "Too many redskins about, as I told you." "There are always too many redskins about," cried Chris impatiently. "I wish we could charge them boldly and send them flying over the plains." "Never to come back again," said Ned sharply. "Yes, that would be very nice, my lads," replied Griggs, "but it will not do to be impatient." "Impatient!" cried Ned. "We've been patient enough." "Not quite, my lads. Don't you see that we're playing a very ticklish game? The plan is to get out of this valley ourselves, where we are regularly locked in, and to put the redskins in our place, locking them in. It would be rather remarkable if it wasn't a ticklish job." Just then the doctor came into the shelter where the boys had been talking, bringing with him Wharton, who had been shooting, or rather trying to shoot, for he had had no success, and they too were talking earnestly about ways and means. "Oh, here you are, Griggs," cried the doctor. "Had a good turn at scouting?" "Yes, sir." "And all seems favourable for our attempt tomorrow?" "No, sir. The Indians have shifted their quarters, and they are in about as awkward a position as they could contrive for our purpose." "Then what do you propose?" "Nothing, sir, but wait." "But we really cannot wait any longer, Griggs. Provisions failing too fast. We must get away from here to some good hunting ground. Do the Indians seem to be camping, or only on the move?" "They seem to me to be hatching up some dodge or another," replied Griggs. "I shouldn't be a bit surprised if we saw them over the way there, just one or two, scouting. And if we do I should be for a stand at arm all night, for it might mean an attack after dark." The doctor stood at the opening looking across the valley, as if impressed by the American's words, and expecting moment by moment to see one of the Indians creeping along the edge of the cliff. Then he began to walk up and down slowly, evidently deep in thought. At last he started, as he suddenly became aware of the fact that everyone present was watching him, keenly waiting for him to speak. "There," he said, "I've made up my mind. It is very evident that we may wait here till our stores are exhausted, and be as far off the opportunity we seek as ever. The Indians can wait. We cannot, and they seem to know it. I believe they fear that if they are patient their opportunity will come. I have felt something of the kind, but I am convinced now that it will not, and that we must chance something and make it." "Going to give up young Chris's plan?" said Griggs slowly. "No, I'm going to put it in force at once. We start tonight." A thrill of excitement ran through Chris, and his heart began to beat. Then he was listening, so to speak, with all his might. "We shall make no particular movement till after dark," continued the doctor. "Only go on as usual apparently, in case there are eyes watching us, as is most likely to be the case." Griggs nodded his head. "But all the same we can be making our preparations. The barrels can be filled with water, and everyone's bottle. Provisions can be packed in our wallets. In fact, everything held ready for a start. Finally, just at dusk, the animals can be driven in for food and water, and—" The doctor stopped and looked full in the American's eyes. "Not allowed to go off again?" "Exactly," replied the doctor. "But before any more is said, Griggs, I want to offer you the opportunity to draw back." "What for?" said Griggs sharply. "Because it is a very risky thing to do. You propose offering yourself for a mark to the Indians' arrows, and—" "Not a bit of it, sir. I'm going to take care they don't hit me." "Yes, yes, but you know what I mean." "Right, I do, neighbour, and it's very handsome of you to offer me the chance to back out. But I'm not going to. I've made up my mind that it's about twice as risky to hold back. For sure as the United States are the finest in the world, if we stop here much longer these cunning savages will give us a surprise, which will end in their losing a lot of men through shot holes in different parts of their persons. But those who escape being hurt will have the satisfaction of taking possession of all the traps of half a dozen folk who came to look for gold, but found only a place to lay their bones alongside of some other folks who got into trouble here ages and ages ago." "Then you mean to hold to your plan?" "I mean to do a bit to carry out young Chris's plan, and shut up the redskins for a week or two, perhaps a month, while we get right away." "There is a horrible side to it, Griggs." "Would be if we let them get the better of us, sir." "You mean the shutting up the enemy here to starve?" said Bourne. "Cha!" ejaculated Griggs, so sharply that the boys started. "Serve 'em right if they did, sir. What business have they to want our scalps? But we shouldn't shut them up to starve. They'd have weeks of work before they could get their horses out. But without horses they'd be out in a week." "Starve? Nonsense! They'd have the water. They can make fires and cook their horses. It takes a deal to starve a redskin. But there, I don't want to make speeches. It's all settled, gentlemen, but you've got to tell the lookout what's coming off. I'm going up to have a few words there at once, said the doctor. Now everyone understands that he is to be ready, without showing any watchful Indian scout that there is something on the way. No one spoke, but the looks directed at the doctor gave answers enough, and the afternoon was spent in preparation for what all felt might prove the most momentous adventure of their lives. End of chapter 49. Recording by Jeana.
Chapter 50 of The Peril Finders by George Fenn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sarah Hanna. Working the Oracle. The evening drew near at last, with everything made ready that was possible. The water and provisions near at hand, saddles and bridles examined, and according to his custom, Chris was about to go out into the valley and see to his pony, examining the wounds and giving him something a little extra in the way of food, when Griggs came down and joined him. "Don't start," he said, "but go on just as usual." "Something wrong?" said Chris, doing exactly what he had been told not to do. "Call it something wrong if you like," said Griggs, laughing, "but it's only what I expected. I've been up at the lookout with your father, and we made out 2 Indians crawling to the top of the cliff over there, just like a couple of big red slugs on a wet night." "Then they're watching us?" panted Chris. "Just as they always have been, my lad, and looking out to try and turn us into pincushions for their arrows, if we'd only go out far enough, which we wouldn't do on any consideration." "But this will quite upset our plans for tonight," said Chris. "Oh no, we shall go on, for this looks promising, my lad. They've always been watching us more or less." "Then they've seen us hunting for a hiding place for the ponies and mules?" "Yes, of course." "And climbing about among the rocks at the Narrows?" "To be sure they have." "Then what's the good of our going on?" "Everything is the good. They've seen everything we've done. But they couldn't think with our brains, could they, my lad?" "But what could they think of our hunting about as we did?" "Well, seeing that I made a point of shooting a bird or 2 each time we were planning out our places and all we meant to do, I should say that they thought we were providing for the pot. Now then, come and have a turn at your pony and spend a good deal of time looking at his hurts. You'd better ask me some questions about them, and lift up his hoofs and point at them." "Yes, I see," said Chris. "Perhaps I shall act a bit too for our friend's benefit, so don't be surprised. Then we shall end up by driving all the beasts in for the night, close up under the shelter of our fire. Shall we be saluted with any arrows, do you think?" "No," said Griggs, "I don't think so. We've rather sickened them of that. They know there are rifles and good shots up at the top yonder, and I dare say some of them have been hit. Now, come along." The pair strolled out towards where the animals were grazing, and went through the bit of performance arranged, Chris marveling the while at the perfect coolness displayed by his companion, who was on the brink of a most daring adventure, the very thought of which sent the blood dancing through the boy's veins and made the palms of his hands turn wet. The shades of night were approaching as, after a long examination of Chris's pony, the animals were headed towards the camp, and driven slowly in towards where they were regularly watered every night. And so well had all the preparations been timed, that it was too dark for any scouts on the opposite side to see that after the watering every beast was hobbled and held in readiness for the start that was to be made. And now the business preparatory to the start was set about eagerly. The mules were laden with the much reduced loads. Skeeter had his, but his bell was muffled so that it would be perfectly silent, and the water barrels were hung in position across the back of their regular bearer. There was plenty of time, and the doctor's principal efforts were directed towards arresting hurry, for he had to allow for the Indian scouts to make their way back to the camp from which they came. "If they have gone back," he said in a low voice, as the adventurous party sat together talking in a low tone, each with his weapons ready. "Yes," said Wilton, "if they have gone back." "Suppose they have chosen this of all nights for an attack?" "They'll find out that we are quite ready for them, that's all," said Griggs coolly. "But it is possible," said Bourne sadly. "So's everything else, sir," replied the American. But don't you think it's a pity to begin fancying what might happen?" "Perhaps so," said Bourne. "I beg pardon. I'm afraid I do anticipate a good deal. Well, boys," he added, turning toward the pair sat together whispering, "how do you feel about tonight's work?" "Horrid, father," whispered Ned, as if he felt that Indians might be listening. "And you, Chris?" continued Bourne. "I feel as if I shall be glad when it's tomorrow and we know the worst." "Or the best, my boy," said the doctor cheerily. "There, I think we might start now. The moon has set, and we have a long dark night before us for our work. What do you say, Griggs? Ready?" "And willing, sir. I go first, don't I?" "Yes, with Chris as advance guard. You know the signal the Indians are coming on to an attack. 1 shot each, and then you stand fast to give us time to start the train back before coming to your support." "Yes, sir. It's all cut deep into me, but I don't think we shall have any trouble there." "I hope not," said the doctor. Within half an hour from these words being spoken, the little baggage train was in motion, dimly seen beneath the band of stars overhead. These stood out strongly marked against the edge of the black cliffs on either side, towering up and seeming to the excited imagination of the two lads double their real height, and overhanging more and more as the valley sides gradually closed in towards the mouth of the gulch. Chris suffered from a peculiar sense of excitement and dread of attack, as he and Griggs rode cautiously on through the darkness, each with his rifle cocked and resting upon his knee, straining his eyes the while for the first sign of danger. And it was during this ride that the boy began to wonder whether the eyesight of the Indians was much better than their own, for he soon found that once more he was obliged to leave out any attempt at guidance and trust entirely to his pony. "Think the enemy can see better than we do?" he ventured to say, during a temporary halt to make out if possible what had caused the sudden rush of sound through the brushes in front. "They're made differently to what we are if they can," whispered the American dryly. "I'm leaving everything to my nag, and you'd better do the same." "That's what I've been doing," said Chris. "You don't think that was an Indian, then?" "No, only some little animal that we started. It sounded loud because everything's so still, and we expect that everything means danger. Keep close behind me now." Chris had no occasion to trouble himself, for his Mustang kept its nose very near to its companion's tail, and they went on and on through the darkness till Griggs suddenly drew rein. "Here we are," he whispered. "It's narrow enough, and it oughtn't to take many minutes to stop this gap so that no horse could get through, while in an hour it might be made so that it would take a week to make it passable. Come along, and mind we don't miss the gully." He led on again slowly, pausing at intervals to listen and make sure, for it seemed to be darker than ever, in spite of their growing accustomed to the gloom. Once more Griggs stopped short, and Chris's heart began to beat more heavily than ever during the few minutes' silence that ensued. "I'm done," whispered Griggs at last. "What do you mean? What's the matter?" asked Chris. "The gully ought to be somewhere about here, but for the life of me I can't make out where it is, and we must wait till morning." Chris laughed softly. "I don't see anything to grin at," grumbled Griggs. "I don't believe any Indian could find his way along here." "I was laughing because I could find the place." "How?" asked Griggs sharply. "By coming first. My pony knows his way here." "Come in front," said Griggs shortly, and Chris moved forward, gave the pony his head once more, and the clever little animal paced steadily on for about 100 yards, and then turned off to its left and began to ascend. "Ha! Who wouldn't be a pony?" said Griggs as Chris drew rein. "Then all we have to do now is to wait till they come up." It did not seem long before the doctor joined them, and then the whole train filed up the side gully. Steadily ascending the way ran towards the tableland, where the grassy patch in a hollow had been selected off the track. And here the halt was made, the beasts beginning to graze at once after they had been hobbled, both ponies and mules, and seeming quite at home as soon as they were left to themselves. "It's a risk indeed," said the doctor. "If the Indians should happen to ride in this direction, where should we be?" "Shooting at them would be the best thing," said Wilton. "It's 1,000 to 1 against their finding the beasts here," said Griggs, "even if they did happen to come. But we've got to chance it, sir. Everything's gone right so far, and let's hope we shall keep on the same track." "I hope so," replied the doctor. "Then now we have nothing to do but get back to the narrow gateway. The sooner the better, sir, for the night's wearing away fast." But ought we, after all, to leave one of us in charge of the beasts here? No, sir, said Griggs sharply. You'll want all your strength after I've passed to tumble down the rocks. The more the better. It mustn't be half done. No, said the doctor gravely. The entrance must be well blocked. All ready? Yes, came in a whisper. Back then, at once. Griggs will lead, and all keep in touch and observe perfect silence. The distance seemed to have doubled before they got to the descent, and this slope to be 3 times as long as they tramped slowly down into the gulch, where the doctor called a halt once more. But all was still, and blacker than ever, as Griggs with Chris at his side turned off to the right, to lead the party slowly onward towards the narrows, where all stood at last, hot and weary. Everything seems to have stretched out, said Griggs in a whisper. I thought we were never going to get here. Then to the doctor. We'd better wait till day begins to break before you climb up the sides, eh? No, said the doctor. That might mean failure. Everyone must be in his place before the darkness fails us. Yes, I suppose you're right, sir. But make sure as soon as there's light enough that everyone is well hidden. Birds will not enter a trap if they see anything strange. Nor Indians neither, said the doctor quietly. We shall see to that. And you'll let them get well out of hearing before you begin to stop the gap? Of course, said the doctor. That's all right then, said Griggs. So now, as you are going to divide into 2 parties, each to take a side, I'll say goodbye and stop below. One word more then, said the doctor, grasping the American's hands. Let's repeat our plans so that there may be no misunderstanding. That's right, sir. I'll say my lesson. As soon as it's daybreak, I shall move down the gully right on in the direction where I believe the Indians are encamped. And as soon as I think I'm near enough, I'm going to begin shooting wherever I see a chance and picking up my birds till the Indians hear me and come out to see what's the matter. Then we suppose they'll mount, the whole herd of them, and come after me. Mounted men against one on foot, said the doctor with a sigh. I don't suppose they'll catch me, said Griggs coolly. Well, naturally enough, when I see the enemy after me, I begin to run. But suppose they don't all come, Griggs, said Chris. Shan't suppose anything of the kind. And don't you talk so loudly, growled the American. They've all got to be there, according to my notions, and come crowding after me. I run as I never ran before, straight for the narrow way here, dash through, making for the old camp, and they tear away to cut me off before I can get under cover of our marksmen. But all at once I dodge in among the stones and begin to climb up to the terraces, get up to the top stepway in the square pit, and loosen out the stones there, after blocking the place below. One of these 2 bits of work is bound to keep those who have dismounted to climb after me from climbing any farther, and when I begin to fire at them pretty sharply, they'll turn back at once, get to their horses, and join their mates, to have a palaver and come to the conclusion that it isn't safe to stop in the valley, because they'll be expecting every moment for fire to be opened by us. Then they'll ride back without another shot being fired at them, for the simple reason that I'm hurrying round to join your people here by the top way and the gully. I shan't lose any time, and if I'm lucky, I may get here soon enough to join you in giving the enemy a few bullets when they come riding back to find their way stopped. As it ought to be, said the doctor dubiously. As it has got to be, said Griggs sharply. Got to be. Got to be and must be, he cried. If all goes well, said Bourne. If all goes well, sir, said Griggs, and if we all do our parts like men, it will. Goodbye. End of chapter 50. Recording by Sarah Hanna, Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Chapter 51 of the Peril Finders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by René Lacroix. The Peril Finders by George Fenn. Chapter 51. Loosening the Stones. "Stop, Griggs!" cried Chris in a hoarse whisper, for he dared not shout, but it seemed as if their brave companion had not heard. One minute he was talking with them, the next he was gone, and had hardly made a sound. "Ha!" sighed the doctor. Now it has come to the point I feel as if we have let the gallant fellow go straight to his death." "Lee!" cried Bourne in a voice of anguish. "Don't say that." "I have said it," said the doctor bitterly. "And now it is too late. I feel that it is true. The whole business looks black, and as desperate as our mad search out here for the old Golden City." He ceased speaking, and Chris gripped Ned by the arm, for he shared his father's feeling of despair. The silence was broken by Bourne. "It is too late to look back," he said gravely. "We have made the venture, and must carry it out like men." "Of course," cried Wilton firmly. "Come, doctor, you are captain. I don't call this square of you to put us all out of heart. This is making the worst of it, with a vengeance." "Yes, it is. It is," said the doctor quickly. "You must forgive me. Every man has his weak moments, and this was one of mine. I felt as if I had sacrificed the poor fellow to this desperate attempt to escape." "Yes, father," cried Chris bitterly. "It was my idea, and you ought to have let me go with him." "Ha, ha!" laughed Wilson. "What are you laughing at?" cried Chris fiercely. "You? Your words came in with such a droll ring in them. But there, we ought not to be talking now, but getting up into our hiding places. Eh, doctor?" "Yes," was the sharp reply. "At once. You, Wilton, Bourne, and Ned. You, Chris, with me. Have you got the crowbar, my boy?" "Yes, father." "You others have the tent pitchers, and I the short pole. Take your places at once. Lie right down among the bushes till you hear my whistle, and then up and send the big stones down with all your might." No more was said, for not one present had the heart to speak. To Chris it was just as if he had said "Goodbye" to the American, who had gone straight to his death. "And he has gone thinking me queer and ungrateful," the boy said to himself, "for not insisting upon going with him." And even while stumbling up and up among the stones and bushes in the darkness to the spot which he was to occupy with his father, the boy could think of nothing else but the brave fellow going slowly along the lower part of the gulch in the black darkness, to wait until the morning came before starting boldly off into the open to meet the Indians. "It will mean arrows," thought Chris. "He'll be shot down somewhere out yonder, for it's a mad trick, and can't do him any good, nor yet us. Oh, I do wish I wasn't such an idiot. So proud I was of my miserable conceit of having thought out a way to trap the Indians, and a nice mess I've made, sent the best friend I ever had to certain death." "What are you thinking about, Chris?" said the doctor at the moment. "Thinking about, father?" faltered the boy. "Yes, you have turned so quiet." "I was thinking about poor Griggs, father, and feeling afraid that he'll never come back." "Then don't think any more of such things. We none of us know. Wait and see. Now then, how long shall we have to wait before we see our brave fellow come along hunted by the enemy?" "Don't ask me, father." "Why not? How far are we off the morning?" "Hours? No, I think not. I dare say we shall be having the daybreak within 1 hour. Then the exciting time will begin." "Do you think we shall see Griggs again?" "Oh, yes, of course. He's a fleet runner, and I shouldn't be a bit surprised to see him coming tearing along with a band of mounted Indians at his back." "Do you really think so, father, or is this only to encourage me?" "Both, my boy. Come, keep a good heart. I shall be glad when the day comes, shan't you?" "Yes, father. But do you think the ponies and mules will stray away?" "I hope not, my boy. Oh, no, it's not likely. Cheer up. We shall do it, never fear." Chris heaved a big sigh. "Well, hullo, my boy, do you call this cheering up?" said the doctor. "Yes, father. That was only the melancholy being driven off," said Chris with a forced laugh. "I'm going to be cheerful enough, and shoot straight when the Indians come. I'm sorry for them, but I must, for everybody's sake." "Yes, to be sure, for everybody's sake. Feel better?" "Yes, father." "That's right. I was low-spirited too, a little while ago, for I felt doubtful of success. I don't now. Yours was a splendid idea, and unless something unfortunate occurs, we shall succeed." "I hope we shall," thought Chris, but he felt doleful in the extreme, and the idea would force itself upon him that he had sent his old friend to a cruel death. At last the various objects around seemed to grow plain as the grey dawn began to lighten the sky. But the place looked terrible in the ghastly light. There beneath them was what looked like a black chasm, the one they were to fill up with stones from the jagged shelves upon which they crouched nearly 100 feet higher, while higher still, right up for another 300 feet or more, to where the saw-like edge was marked clearly against the ever-lightening sky. Wherever the boy's eyes rested, there was masses of stone which looked as if a touch would set them in motion and start others to come thundering down, sweeping all before them into a vast heap which would fill up the chasm, even as high as the rocks amongst which his party was hidden. The time had come for hiding, and Chris and his father were soon lying down behind some stunted bushes, through which they could peer right along the bottom of the gulch, far away towards where the side gully ran up in the direction of the tableland in which the great valley with its rock city was cut. Thoughts began to come fast now through Chris's brain, and the first were in connection with the mules and ponies they had left to graze up to the right of the gully. Would they stay there peaceably, browsing on the green shoots of the shrubs that were abundant, or come wandering down to reach their old pasture? The question was open to many doubtful answers which did not come, and they had to give way to thoughts connected with Griggs, who, the boy felt, must by this time be astir with his gun. And with what result? None for a long, long time, during which the sun, as it rose, had chased away the horrors that had lingered in the gulch, to display all its wondrous glories of light and shade with trickling falls and clumps of dripping lace-like fern. Everything was so beautiful in the sunshine that Chris found himself wondering how it could have been so dismal in the gloom. He turned to look across to where his friends were hidden, but they were concealed too well. Nothing was visible but the great blocks of stone waiting to be levered to the edge of the shelf and sent thundering down, so turning his eyes from there, the lad gazed along the gulch again in the direction of the side gully and the open land beyond, where in all probability Griggs was now wandering in his fictitious search for game. 2 hours of patient waiting since sunrise, which had given place to painful excitement. Doubt was busy, too, in every brain, for it began to seem as if something had gone wrong, and the intense desire was attacking Chris to get down from his hiding place and go in search of his friend. But the orders were to lie still in hiding until the doctor gave the signal with his whistle, and knowing full well that the slightest suggestion of an ambush meant ruin to the plan, Chris forced himself to lie motionless, gazing with aching eyeballs along the gulch for the sight of the figure that, as the time went on, seemed as if it would never appear. Another hour, the most hopeless of all, the most wearisome and full of pain, for with the sun getting higher, the rays were reflected from the rock face till the place grew unbearably hot, with the consequence that thirst began to parch the watcher's throat. He was growing faint, too, for want of food, and though he had an ample supply in his wallet, he did not dare to begin eating for fear that something might happen, some sudden call be made upon his energies. "If I could only get up and move about," thought Chris. But he glanced round, and no one else was stirring, while his father crouched there, so severe and stern of aspect that for a moment Chris forgot his own troubles and thought of those of others. "Father's feeling it all horribly," thought the boy. "But poor old Griggs, we ought never to have let him go." What was that? Chris strained his ears and gazed upward wildly, for high in front, nearly 400 feet above the bottom of the gully, there was the sound of galloping horses. The boy shook himself and stared, asking himself if he were mad or dreaming, for the rocks up there were more than perpendicular, they leaned right over, and it was absurd to think that horses were galloping there. They could not be. They were not, for they were on the other side of the gulch now, higher still. "It's the heat," said Chris with a sigh. "I'm giddy, I suppose." "Hist!" The warning came from his father, and a thrill of excitement ran through the boy as he felt that it was no fancy but the echoing of galloping horses to which he was listening, while the next minute, as the reverberation grew louder, a spasm, half joy, half fear, ran through him, as like a flash the familiar figure of the American glanced in the sunshine, disappeared in the shade, and came into sight again, with head down, fists doubled and held close to his breast, as he came running rapidly along the bottom of the gulch. The next minute he had reached the narrow chasm above which Chris and his friends lay waiting, disappeared, and the inclination that nearly carried Chris away was to spring up, shout words of encouragement, and then clamber to where he could follow the swift runner with his eyes till he went out of sight at some turn of the gulch on his way to the valley. But the orders were to lie close till the whistle rang out, and like the rest, who were influenced by the same feeling, Chris crouched lower to gaze right away in the old direction, listening with straining nerves to the ever-nearing echoing beat of horses' hoofs, till about a couple of 100 yards away a mounted Indian, bow and arrow in one hand, rein in the other, bounded into sight, urging on his pony with voice and hand. "Will he know that it's a trap?" thought Chris, and he fully expected to see the man draw a rein, send an arrow amongst the hiding party, and gallop off. But even as the thought ran through the lad's brain, the savage reached the narrow gap and dashed through. By this time 2 more were close behind, a party of 4, some 50 yards in the rear, all galloping hard, eager to overtake the fugitive, while as they passed through at full gallop, the echoes of the hoofs increased, for a mob of about 30 came into sight, all tearing along as in a race, had passed through the gap. Right into the trap, thought Chris, whose pulses literally bounded with the excitement of the scene that had passed beneath his feet. "We've got them," he panted. "Now, father, the stones." But it was beneath his breath that the words came, and his face flushed and his eyes dilated, for as the echoing of the horse's hoofs began to die out behind it, grew louder in front, and another troop of the enemy came into sight, tearing along after their leaders, to dash through the gap in 1s and 2s, trailing along till the last had disappeared. "That must be all," panted Chris to himself, but he was wrong. The echoes of the rocky walls had not ceased, though greatly softened down, for 24 more of the savages came tearing along like a rearguard to pass through, and even then more were to come, for a couple raced up, shouting at and beating the flanks of their ponies angrily, as if in fear of being left quite behind. "The last," thought Chris, now wild with excitement, for the reverberations had ceased in front, were dying out behind, and then all was still for a few moments, before out of the utter silence came the soft piping sound of a whistle. "Hooray!" cried Chris, for he felt that he must get rid of the breath that literally burned in his chest as he sprang up. Then crash, splinter, and shiver came from below, as the doctor forced the first block to the edge of the shelf where the opening was most narrow. This was almost accompanied by another shivering crash, repeated both from the walls of the gulch, like so much smothered thunder. "Now for it," panted Chris, as he caught sight of Ned bending down to roll a great block far too big for him over and over. But the one he was himself handling was as big, and Ned, who was not 10 yards away from him, laughed mockingly as he got his block to the edge first and sent it down with a crash. But the noise made by the one sent after it by Chris formed, as it were, an echo, and he stood for a few moments gazing down in wonder, for huge pieces had been forced off the shelf by Wilton and Bourne, to lie gathered so closely together that already the way was blocked sufficiently to make it impossible for any horse to pass unless at a flying leap, for which there was neither take-off nor landing at the end. "Don't shout, don't cheer," panted the doctor. "Work steadily and well, and we shall soon have them fast." "I hope there are no more to come and have us," panted Wilton as he slaved away, making Chris and Ned both glance excitedly away through the gulch towards where the gully struck off. But the enemy seemed to be all within the trap, and the stones were forced down till nearly all available on the shelves had been sent thundering down, and both parties climbed some 50 feet higher before they continued the work, beginning with the highest blocks that were loose, and having the satisfaction of seeing the heaviest block there, which took 2 or 3 to move it, go roaring down, sweeping with it others nearly as big. They worked for fully half an hour, to look down at last in wonder to see the great success of their work, the gap being piled high, and, leaving horses out of the question, forming a barrier that it would be hard work for an active man to climb. "Stop now," said the doctor, and all gladly rested, to stand wiping the perspiration from their steaming faces. "No horses can possibly pass by here." "Mind, quick, down with you," shouted Wilton, and as he spoke an arrow struck against the rock wall close to his head and glanced off, to fly far away along the gulch. End of chapter 51. Recording by René Lacroix, Woodstock, Ontario, Canada.
Chapter 52 of the Peril Finders by George Fenn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sarah Hanna. The Progress of the Plan. A narrow escape, said Bourne, and another arrow passed over without injury to anyone present, for the simple reason that all had obeyed the warning and dropped behind the nearest cover. Be on the alert, cried the doctor from the other side. That means they are coming back. And Griggs was to have been with us by this time to help in the fight. Father, this looks bad. The doctor met his son's eyes, and then turned to look in the direction from which their companion would be bound to arrive if he had managed to escape over the terraces to make for the gully. Don't judge rashly, my boy, said the doctor. He has had very little time yet. Are you all ready for the enemy? Yes. Came back quickly enough, but there was no enemy visible. Could you see who sent that arrow, Wilton? No, but there are 2 ponies grazing up yonder. I fancy they must belong to the last Indians we saw come by. It looks like it, as only 2 shots have come, but we shall have the whole body coming back soon. Close upon 100, said Wilton, and we are 5. Yes, 5 in a strong fortress with modern weapons against instruments of barbarism. And what is more, we have dealt the enemy such a blow as will take them long enough to get over. But I wish we were all together, Father, instead of being divided. Wouldn't it be better if we tried to get to them? No, said the doctor quietly. We are quite right here for the present, and perhaps we shall have our side strengthened soon by the coming of friend Griggs. Ah, sighed Chris, if he only would! Another arrow struck the rocks close to where Bourne and his friends were watchfully scanning the gulch between them and the old camp, and directly after a shot was fired, making everyone start to look where the little gray puff of smoke arose, and Wilton was calmly reloading his rifle. I marked that fellow down, he said coolly. Did you hit? Said the doctor. I think so. He has altered his position and is lying flat. Don't fire! A friend! Came in a familiar voice from behind them, and the boys gave a cheer, which was answered by Griggs, who now appeared, coming at a trot along the gulch from the direction of the gully, and began to climb up on the doctor's side. I did hope to be in time, he said, as he reached Chris and lay down, breathing hard. Not done much, I hope. You are in time, cried Chris, catching at the American's hand to have his own pressed firmly. We've been in great anxiety about you, Griggs, cried the doctor, pressing his friend's other hand. You'd have felt worse than that, sir, if you'd seen my wig, said the American with a chuckle. They came so near catching me that my hair began to rise at the thought of being cut shorter than ever it was cut before, and made into an ornament. They nearly had me before I got to the first terrace. You know, there's a chap yonder going to send an arrow at us, Chris, lad. You'd better shoot. Chris followed the direction indicated by the American's pointing finger, saw where a big Indian was drawing his bow, showing only his face and arms around a corner, and drew trigger, with the result that he struck the stone and sent splinters flying, and after them the Indian, evidently hurt badly, for he held his left arm with his right hand. Go on, Griggs, said Chris, reloading. You were saying, you know, and then you stopped. To be sure, said Griggs, whose breath was still coming in gasps, as he lay on his chest with his rifle ready now for a shot. I was going to say, you know I can run fast. Yes, yes, cried Chris eagerly. Go on. I did, said Griggs, as hard as I could, but a galloping horse is too much for me, and I won't back myself against one again. But you got into safety, cried Chris. Only just. I believed I saved myself by about 1.5 inches. That was enough, though, to let me shut and lock the door we had got ready. Did you fire? Asked the doctor. Fire? Never had time, sir. But there, I managed to shut up, I hope, so that the brutes couldn't follow me, and then I hurried on to join you. Tut, tut, what a cracker that is! I didn't hurry a bit. It was a regular crawl to the gully. Think me long? Horribly, cried Chris. No wonder, my lad. It was a horrible crawl, for I was regularly done. I felt what the Americans call real bad. But now tell me, did the whole band come by here? As far as we can tell, replied the doctor. That's right. I never had time to look back, but it seemed to me as if the whole Indian nation was after my scalp on horseback. They didn't get it, did they, Chris? Get it? No, of course not. I'm glad of that. but it felt precious cold 2 or 3 times. But now tell me, you've begun shooting. Are the enemy coming on? I believe we have only been attacked by a couple of stragglers. 2 had passed through the narrow gap here last. And you've filled the gap well up? Oh, yes. No horse could get by here. That's right. Then the big lot haven't found out yet that they are trapped? Certainly not, said the doctor. Then there's going to be a big fight when they do find out, said Griggs quietly. I don't want them to come yet till my hand grows a bit steady, for, kill and slay or no, we've got to bring down all we can. I suppose so, said the doctor gravely. It's their lives or ours. Yes, they'll be real mad, and we've got to give them a lesson, one that will make them shy of trying bows and arrows against rifles. Yes, getting all right again now, continued the speaker in answer to eager inquiries from the other side of the gap. That's right, said Bourne. Lee? Yes? What do you think of making for the ponies and mules now, before the Indians find that they're trapped? May I tell 'em, sir? Said Griggs sharply. Yes, say what you think, cried the doctor. Look here, Mr. Bourne, said Griggs quickly. The doctor thinks the same as I do, that it would be mad, giving ourselves up to be massacred. We've got to hold this barricade for our lives, and shoot down every man who tries to climb it. There must be no misses this time. Do you hear, boys? You're fighting for your fathers' lives as well as your own. It's no time to be sorry for the poor Indians now. Shoot your best, and leave them to be sorry for themselves. By the way, Chris, my lad, can you give me a drink out of your water bottle? I'm pretty well dried up. I had to fling mine away so as to run lighter, and it was getting so close that I was very nearly sending my rifle and cartridges off as well, but I managed to bring them home. Ha! He continued, after a long draught from the bottle Chris handed to him. What fine stuff water is. I think we've found out that, Squire Bourne, even if we haven't found the gold. Hush! Listen, cried the doctor, and he held up his hand. For there was a peculiar reverberation from the rocks farther on towards the rock city, a sound that thrilled the listeners through and through. Yes, that's them coming, sir, said Griggs coolly. They're only riding gently, though, and it doesn't seem as if they know what's happened to them yet. We shall see them along that curve soon. Now, doctor, will you give your orders about how we are to shoot? Slowly and steadily, replied the doctor, and always at the leading men. Listen, Wilton. We 3 will fire one by one while you all hold your hands to be ready to keep on while we reload, so that they will not be able to advance without seeing their men constantly falling. There must be no excitement, always a careful, steady aim. When shall we begin? Asked Wilton. As soon as the first man rides out into the open yonder. Then it's time to begin at once, sir, said Wilton sharply, for here they come. Yes, said the doctor firmly. Keep well in cover, everyone. Wait till I give the word. I want the leaders to see that the way is barred against their retreat. They're beginning to see it already, said Griggs, as about 20 of the Indians rode round the curve into sight, and their quick eyes grasped the fact at once that something had happened at the gap since they passed by. Look out! Wear arrows, said Griggs in a low, deep growl. Tell 'em, doctor, that they needn't mind those plaything toys so long as they keep well under cover. We can hear what you say, said Bourne, and an anxious half-minute passed before there was a sudden yell, sounding wild and harsh, to echo and re-echo from the mighty walls on either side, while as it went reverberating on from side to side to die away in the distance, there was another shout, and close upon it the whiz of a flight of arrows, and then a tinkling, splintering sound as they struck against the stones to snap or glance off, the air just about the barrier seeming for a moment full of the glistening barbed wands. Fire! Said the doctor loudly, and crack, crack, crack. With measured slowness the rifles of all 3 rang out, to raise a fresh set of echoes, and as these were still repeating themselves, another and a fiercer yell rang out, for 3 of the mounted men had gone down and their horses had dashed forward, charging right at the barrier, snorting and tossing their manes, but only to turn back, startled by the heap of rocks piled up before them, and returned at a fierce gallop to confuse the crowd they had left, when the rifles from the other side flashed out fire in white puffs of smoke, and 3 more of the enemy went down, to free their startled and plunging ponies from their riders' reins. A yell more fierce than ever arose from the little crowd of Indians, whose mounts began to partake of the excitement imparted by the ponies that had begun to tear to and fro in the narrow gulch, while after discharging another innocuous flight of arrows against the barrier of stones, about a dozen of the savages came on, yelling and belaboring their mounts, driving them nearly frantic as they urged them forward. The riders were evidently imbued with a mad belief that their half-wild steeds would surmount the barrier by leaps and climbing, as after a short wild career they were forced right at the rugged mass of stones. Fully half-breasted it, some to fall, others to wrench themselves round, while others again flung their riders, to gallop back snorting with excitement as they returned to dash into the halting mob they had left and add fresh confusion there. They were exciting moments at the barrier. One Indian pitched upon his head to lie senseless, but 3 more regained their feet, tore their knives from their belts, and placing them between their teeth to leave their hands free, began to climb up the slope of rough, jagged stones to take vengeance upon the whites who had dared to oppose their attack. But not one of them reached the top of the hurled-down masses of rock, which were, after all, not halfway up to where the little party crouched, patient, cool, and watchful, as they obeyed their leader's orders not to waste a shot. The result of the desperate attack was that one man stopped short, tottered, and fell back to roll over to the bottom, and then begin to crawl slowly back, leaving his comrades motionless where they had fallen. There was a few minutes' pause as the one man crept painfully back, and then about a dozen of the Indians dismounted and joined in driving the frantic ponies that were galloping about through an opening made for them by the waiting band. This done, the party remounted and set up another furious yell to frighten the defenders from their posts. Needless to say, this was as vain as the next and larger flight of arrows which splintered amongst the stones or glanced off to fly far overhead. There was no firing now by the defenders, for the need was not urgent. "Let them exhaust themselves," cried the doctor, "and find out that their efforts are vain." Still there was no lack of bravery amongst the savages, who, some 20 strong, being as many as could act in the narrow gully, charged home again, directly after sending in their arrows, and accompanying the beating of their ponies' hoofs with yell after yell. This time there was no waiting on the part of the defenders, who began firing as soon as the advance commenced, with the result that several Indians dropped, to encumber the way and unsettle the serried band of plunging steeds, while the rest, on breasting the rocks, recoiled, and in a state of panic turned, regardless of yells and blows, to gallop back after the fashion of their kind, crowding together till they reached their fellows once again, to stand shivering, snorting, and stamping, but leaving 2 struggling in the bottom of the gulch in company with 6 of their riders, wounded or dead. "That ought to settle them," said Wilton, who knelt carefully wiping his rifle. "I hope so," said Bourne. "I'm tired of this murderous work." "'Tis bad, sir," said Griggs from the other side, "but it rests with the redskins." "Do you think they will give up now, Griggs?" said the doctor. "No, sir, I don't," was the reply. "Oh, Griggs, you're making the worst of it," cried Chris. "No, my lad, I'm not. It's of no use for me to talk nonsense. I know too much of Indian nature. All they're thinking of now is how to get at us, and have revenge for what we have done." "Then you think they will attack again?" "Sure to, sir," replied Griggs, "but perhaps not with a rush. If they don't, they'll wait till it's dark, and then leave their horses behind and come on with their knives." "Ugh!" ejaculated Chris. "That will be bad for us." "Horrid," said Griggs coolly. "It seems—" "Hallo! They're coming on again. Give 'em a volley, sir, this time." "Yes," cried the doctor eagerly, as he saw at a glance that the Indians were gathering for another rush. "Hold your fire," he cried loudly, "till they are 3 parts of the way here, and then all together. I'll give the word." "But suppose they come on, dismount, and attack afterward," said Chris. "You have the second barrels," said the doctor. "Be ready. Here they come." For once more the savages were putting their regular tactics to the test, coming on yelling and waving their weapons, using them to frighten their foes as much as to madden their ponies into a furious gallop, and this right in the rear of another flight of arrows, half of which came from the Indians who remained behind for want of room. To the boys, this was the most exciting charge of all, for during the others they had something to do or see, as the firing was kept up almost from the first. Here they had to wait, only for minutes, it is true, but moments which seemed like minutes, and during which they had no gathering smoke to hide the gleaming teeth, flashing eyes, and savage hate depicted in the red and painted faces coming swiftly on. "Fire!" shouted the doctor, his voice sounding sharp and clear above the rattle of hoofs, the yells of savages, and the reverberations from the rocky sides of the gulch. Every finger pressed the trigger at the same moment. There was a flash, 6 jets of gray smoke driven full in the faces of the oncoming ponies, and then one great crack, followed by a deafening roar, which combination checked the ponies as if by magic, making them rear up, dismounting several of their riders. Then they all tore back, leaving 8 or 9 Indians scrambling to their feet to run after their steeds, others lying struggling among the stones, and plain to see 2 more tottering upon their ponies' backs, one falling forward to cling to his mount's neck, another sink backward and drop off, and another to wrench himself round and shake his bow at the occupants of the barrier in impotent fury, before throwing up his hands and lying back clinging to his seat till his pony had plunged into the little crowd waiting their return. "The most effective action yet," said the doctor hoarsely, as the reloading ended. "Yes, sir, I think that's the best," responded Griggs. "But such a sickening slaughter of the poor ignorant wretches," cried Bourne bitterly. "That's what I used to think when I was first up in the Rockies, sir," said Griggs coolly, "till I had been about a bit, and seen where the redskins up there had been amongst the settlers' ranches. Pleasant homes burned down, and men, women, children lying where they had been murdered and cut about. People who had been living hopeful lives, hard workers whose only crime against the Indians was trying to get a living out of a few acres instead of by hunting and war. I used to feel just as you do, Mr. Bourne, but I don't now." I know," cried Ned's father passionately, "but they are so ignorant of our power." "Yes, sir, but we're not of theirs," replied Griggs. "Now, doctor, they're drawing off. Had enough of it for one day, and it's time to be stirring." "What, retreat?" "Not yet, sir. Here's my idea. They'll wait till it's dark, attack us then with knives and tomahawks, coming on silently, leaving their horses behind, and we shan't have a chance." "Then what do you propose?" said the doctor. "Just this, sir, if you can't see a better way. We 3 stop here, ready to have a shot at any Indian who shows himself, while Mr. Bourne, young Squire, and Chris go off to the mules and horses." "No!" cried Chris. "I'm not going to leave my father." "Wait, my boy," said the doctor sternly. "But father—" "Silence, sir!" "Hadn't done speaking, my lad," said Griggs, looking at the boy with a smile. "Here's the rest of it. Mr. Bourne and Squire Ned get old Skeeter to the front and set off at once as fast as the mules will go, which only means a walk." "But where? Where?" cried Bourne excitedly. "Anywhere, sir, except into the Soda Plains. The thing you've got to do is put as many miles between you and here as you can manage in the next 24 hours. "What, and desert you?" cried Bourne. "How are you going to manage to find us?" "Oh, I'll find you by your trail when the time comes, sir," said Griggs, laughing. "Don't you be afraid of that. Don't even think about it, only of getting right away." "I see," said the doctor, and he frowned down Chris, who was about to speak. "Now go on." "There's not much more to say, sir. We shall stay here till dusk, giving the redskins a reminder now and then that we're on the alert. And at last, when we feel that they are coming on for the attack, into the saddles we jump, and steal off till we're out of hearing, and then crawl till we make sure of the trail of the mules, and then gallop." "But the ponies will have gone with the mules," cried Chris excitedly. "You'd better not let them," said Griggs with a grim smile at the boy. "You've got to see the train started well on its way from the bottom of the gully, and then bring the horses here. All 6, mind." "Yes, I see," said Chris, brightening up, the sun seeming to come out on his gloomy, powder-smirched face. "But what about Ned's and Mr. Bourne's ponies?" "They'll have to be contented with mules. They've only got to walk, and there are several now with half-loads. We shall want their ponies for spare mounts, so as to give the others a rest now and then, for when we leave here we shall have to make the best of our way." "Oh!" cried Chris joyously. "I wish I were as clever as you are, Griggs." "It's all right, my lad," said the American grimly. Don't be in a hurry. I've learned a bit about the Indians, and you've got that to begin with. By the time you get as old as I am, you'll have picked up a deal more than I know, and you will not think much of me then. Now, Doctor, what's your idea?" "Yours, Griggs," cried the gentleman addressed. "It cannot be bettered. You hear, Bourne?" "Yes, I hear," was the reply. "But about the Indians, you will not escape 'em. They'll follow your trail." "A bit," said Griggs, "while they're hot and wild after finding out that we've tricked them and gone. But I seem to think that they won't tramp far and leave their mustangs shut up in the valley. They'll come back to get them out, and that will take them days, even if they do it then, while if they can catch us after giving us about a week's law, I shall feel disposed to forgive them." "We need not discuss the matter further, eh, Wilton?" said the doctor, turning to the young man who had crouched close by, watching the spot where the Indians had disappeared. "No, it's all cut and dried," said the young man quietly. "Be off, Bourne. You're going to have the best of it." "That father isn't," said Ned sharply. "I don't think it's fair. Let Chris go. I want to stop and fight." "Nay, nay, nay," said Griggs, smiling. "Don't be greedy, lad. You've killed quite as many redskins today as is good for you. Be satisfied. I dare say we can contrive a bit more fighting for you by and by." "He may have all my share," said Chris, screwing up his face. "I hate it. It's horrible." "Obey orders," said the doctor, smiling. "Bourne, will you get off at once?" "Yes," was the reply. "And you, boys, I don't think any eyes can reach us, for we get no more arrows now, but all the same I would not show. Crawl down to the bottom. You will be safe from all observation there, and you can rise and walk as soon as you are past the first curve. Till we meet again." "Till we meet again," said Bourne and Ned in a breath, and they began to crawl down the far side of the gulch from where they had made their defense. "As for you, my boy," continued the doctor, "you will bring the ponies down, following the mules, and coming to a halt at the spring by the big needle-like stone. There's some browsing for them there." "Am I to stay with them, father?" said Chris. "Of course, my boy, to be ready for starting at a moment's notice. But if you have to fight again?" "We 3 will do our best." "But only 3, father?" "Only 3, but 3 men fighting with the knowledge that if things go against them they have ponies waiting for them, ready for a retreat. Now, my boy, duty. Be off. And mind, you'll take no notice of a few shots." Chris made no reply. His rifle was already slung, and after one glance up the gulch towards the valley, without seeing a sign of the enemy, he began to back down the slope, creeping and crawling till it was safe to rise, and then hurrying after Bourne and Ned, overtaking them long before they could reach the entrance to the steep slope of the gully. End of chapter 52. Recording by Sarah Hanna, Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Chapter 53 of the Peril Finders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Peril Finders by George Fenn. Chapter 53. A Bit of Blue Sky. The task of getting the mules together was simple enough, the irritable beasts making their usual objections, but following their old leader Skeeter quietly enough, in spite of the bell not being in use. And in a short time they were trudging along with their loads down the steep slope till the gulch was reached, and Chris came after them with the ponies to bring his charge to a halt. "Like to change places, Ned?" he said archly. "No, I'm going to do my part without that." "Good-bye, Chris, my lad," said Bourne sadly. "I don't like going off and leaving you." "And I don't like you to go, Mr. Bourne," said Chris, holding out his hand, which was warmly grasped. "Take care of yourself, Ned." "Yes, and you," said the boy sadly. The next minute Chris was standing by his mustang's head, watching the mules file away. "Look at that," said Chris, as he noted that his charge displayed no desire to follow the mules. "Why, if that old Skeeter isn't actually sneering at my ponies, he deserves to be kicked for his conceit." Ned turned to wave his hand just before a bend in the gulch hid the mule train from sight, and then Chris mounted and rode towards the pointed rock, close to which the spring gurgled out of the rock. Here he took the precaution of drinking deeply himself before letting the ponies have their fill of the refreshing water. after which they began grazing in their quiet, inoffensive way, leaving their guardian to his thoughts, which were many and troubled. In the full expectation of hearing shots, Chris spent plenty of time in listening, but no reports reached his ears, and he began thinking of the change from the wild excitement and risk of his position by the barrier just a short time before, to the silence and grandeur of the deeply cut rift in which he now stood. For gloomy and forbidding as the place looked by night, even awful in its black solemnity, it was striking enough now in its effects of brilliant sunshine and shade to make the boy think it was one of the most beautiful places he had ever seen in his life. "What a pity," he muttered as he listened to the crop of the ponies. He did not say what was a pity, for the sharp crack of a rifle brought him out of his musings to gaze sharply in the direction of the barrier, far away from where he was waiting, and wondering now whether there was any more fighting on the way. Another sharp crack, and Chris's excitement increased as he first looked anxiously at his charges to see if they were startled by the firing. But the ponies did not even lift their heads, but went on browsing upon the green shoots near the spring, while the boy involuntarily dragged his rifle round, ready to throw the sling over his head if the need sprang up for its use. But there was evidently no immediate danger, for quite an hour passed before there was another shot fired to raise the echoes, and this proved to be single. A longer period elapsed before anything more occurred, and twice as long a time passed before there was another. "It's just as they said," thought Chris, "a shot or two just to show the redskins that we're on the alert." It was about this time that Chris fancied that the faintness from which he suffered was due to the want of food, and opening his wallet he took out a piece of damper, to find that it ate very sweet, with nothing but a few handfuls of water to wash it down. By the time this was finished the sun had sunk far below the rocks on his left, and the dreamy, restful state into which the boy had been falling passed away. For the thoughts that came fast now were beginning to grow troublous. It would not be long before it was night, and with the darkness an exciting time would arrive. Chris thought that the Indians would not wait long before they attacked, and a great anxiety now oppressed him. Would his father think of this and be prepared, or would he wait too long, and then? It was too horrible to think of. Chris all through that afternoon had been suffering from the effect of his exertions, and had sunk into a restful state, a long way on to the border which divides wakefulness from sleep. But with the coming of darkness his brain had become active to a painful degree, and but for the stringent orders he had received to be prepared and wait with the ponies, he would have gone forward, sought his father, and told him of his fears. "He's sure to know better than I do," cried the boy at last, to comfort himself, but with very poor effect, as he kept his watch till the darkness had seemed to settle down like a flood in the gulch. The ponies had become invisible, and the sky had turned to a dark purple, with a few stars dotting here and there. Half an hour now passed, and then the boy's agonized tension was broken by 3 shots ringing out almost together. "A volley," he said aloud, and the words had hardly passed his lips before there was a repetition of the reports. "The other 3 barrels," he cried excitedly, and then, speaking as if to those of whom he thought were close at hand, "Load, load, load," he panted. "Oh, quick, quick, they're coming on." He waited again, but there was not a sound, and half an hour seemed to have passed, during which his busy brain invented a host of horrors, chief among which was that in which he pictured to himself the Indians stealing up to the defenders of the barrier, knife in hand, to spring upon them and massacre all before they could fire another shot in their defense. So horrible became the silence at last, that Chris felt that if it lasted much longer he must mount his mustang and ride forward to learn the worst. "Even if they kill me," he muttered, and he mentally saw himself falling beneath the enemy's blows. But in response to a desperate effort to recall his duty, those thoughts grew dull and distant, and straining his eyes to gaze into the darkness, he obeyed a sudden impulse to slip the ponies' bridles into their mouths, fasten a strap or two, and then tighten the saddle girths, the animals submitting patiently enough and allowing themselves to be placed in readiness for a start. "I can't do anything more," he said to himself. "Oh, how terribly dark!" Psst! From close at hand, so close to him that the boy started as if he had been stung. "Father," he whispered. "Good lad, not a word. Are the ponies saddled and bridled?" "Yes, father." "Right. Now, Griggs, Wilton, take 2 each and lead on. Walk with them for the present, and as quietly as you can go. We'll follow close behind." No further words were spoken, but there was the sound of hoofs passing over the stony bottom of the gulch, and the next minute Chris and his father, each leading his pony, were walking together side by side, the animal stepping instinctively in the footprints of those in front, and, saving for the faint sound of tramping, the silence seemed to the boy perfectly awful. At last Chris could keep back a question no longer. "The firing, father! I heard 2 volleys. Were the savages coming on?" "No, but we treated them as if they were, just to show them that we were waiting for an attack, and then came on to join you at once. Now, no more talking. I want to listen till they announce they're here." "Will they?" whispered Chris. "They'll either attack with one of their savage yells, or else give one in their rage when they find we're gone. That will be the signal for us to mount and ride for our lives. Indians are swift of foot, boy." It seemed an hour, during which every ear was on the strain, but probably it was not a fourth of that time before the fierce yell of the savages was heard, but it only reached the fugitives as a faint whisper, followed by another. Fortunately, the retiring party had reached where the gulch had opened out, and quite a broad band of brilliant stars was spread overhead from rock wall to rock wall, giving sufficient light for the ponies to follow one another in Indian file at a good round trot, which was kept up hour after hour, with intervals of walking and the indulgence now in a little conversation regarding the distance ahead of the mule train or the possibility of its being missed. But Griggs was positive. "No," he said, "we can't have overrun them." "But have they turned off somewhere? I don't remember any side valley, but we may have passed one." "No, we mayn't, sir," said Griggs coolly. "We don't know it. At least, I don't suppose you did, for I fancy I do. But if the mules had turned off anywhere, our clever mustangs would have done the same. They've been following the mules' trail ever since we started." "What? Impossible in this darkness." "Think so, sir? Well, suppose you wait and see." There was silence for a while, before the doctor rode to the front again, where Chris was now beside Griggs. "We've heard nothing of the enemy," he said. "No, sir, I've listened till it has given me a feeling like toothache." "Do you think they're on our trail?" "Ah, there I can't say anything, sir, only that they may be. But if they are, they're coming on at a regular crawl, I'm sure of that." "How can you be so sure?" said the doctor wonderingly. "Because they'll be, as Indians mostly are when they can't see their quarry, horribly suspicious of being led into an ambush." "They did not seem so when they followed you." "No, they could see me, and they forgot to be in doubt in the heat of the pursuit. But on a night like this, and after the way in which we've shot them down, they are bound to feel their way step by step if they follow at all. Most likely they'll wait till morning, when they'll pick up our trail. And then come on as fast as they can run, sir. They won't ride." Griggs finished off with a loud chuckle. "Say, Chris," he added, "won't they be mad at not being able to get out their ponies?" "I suppose so," said Chris. "But there's a good side to everything. It'll be grand for the poor beasts. They're ridden nearly to death. Now they'll have a good rest with plenty of fine pasture." "But about tomorrow, Griggs," said Chris. "What about tomorrow?" "The Indians may follow us and overtake us on foot." "Well, if they do, they do, my lad, and at the very worst they may capture some of our stores. But perhaps not. I don't like being a brute to a dumb beast, but if I'm driven to it, I may have to be a bit hard to some of those mules. They can go so fast that no Indian can catch them if they like." "Yes?" "Well, as a rule they don't like." "That's the worst of it," said Chris. "Yes, but this time they've got to like, and I know how to make them." Daybreak at last, and with that dawn all doubts about the mule convoy were at an end, for the first streaks of dawn showed them about a mile ahead, trudging steadily along with no broadening of the day. Not even the rising of the sun revealed that for which a most anxious lookout was kept, namely, so many dark dots to indicate that the Indians were on their trail. "I say they won't come now," said Griggs decisively. "We'll halt, sir, at the first water and have a good rest and feed." "Will it be safe?" said the doctor. "We must chance that, sir, for the sake of making horse, mule, man and boy fit for what more he has to do." "Well, perhaps so." It won't be losing time, and the mules and horses have done a good spell of work. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of the Peril Finders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Peril Finders by George Fenn. Chapter 54. Onward. Whether the Indians followed up their trail, the Peril Finders never knew, for they saw no more of that tribe, and wandered on for days in safety, passing into a new tract of country which Griggs hailed with delight. "It's not Goldie Land," he said, pointing, "but a place where we can do a good deal of hunting and lay up stores, dried meat for stock, before we enter the mountains yonder." "Why do you say that?" asked Ned. "Because of those old bleached bones?" "Yes, buffalo. That means going on for months. Once we hit upon the tail end of a drove, we can hang on to them as long as we like, and head them in towards the mountains and forest land yonder. There's a peak there that looks very like the one we want to find." But the weeks went on, during which the bison drove was found, and supplied the party with all the meat they needed, and sport besides, at the long gaunt wolves, always on the lookout for the weakly calves. There was sport, too, with the bears, and a narrow escape for the doctor from a grizzly, which overtook and clawed him from his pony's back, the end seeming very near. But Chris Lee's rifle bullet was quicker than the huge bear, whose skin, when sun-dried, became the doctor's bed by night, when it was hot, his cover when it was cold. Then the great peak, reached at last, gave the adventurers a wondrous view all round, but not of the Golden City, which always seemed to be farther off, while none of the peaks they found accorded with the old prospector's map. But as the time glided on, adventures were always at hand. Another strange rock city was discovered, evidently inhabited at a later date, for here the old dwellers' domestic implements were plentiful in the cell-like homes cut in the terraces of cliff or canyon. Great earthen hand-made pots that had evidently held some kind of grain, flint heads for arrows, and those of larger size which might have been used for spears. And so the journeying went on, with times when Indians surprised the party and were driven off, while others again that were found by a rushing river proved friendly and willing to show the strange white people how it was possible to get mule loads of a kind of salmon in a day from the rushing waters for present eating and for splitting open and drying in the sun. Then bison again, another salmon river, a narrow escape from a horrible death by thirst once more, encounters with rattlesnakes, the discovery in a great open plain of the cause of a distant roaring sound like water, just at a time when it was once more wanted most. And there it was, where they could look down, Tantalus-like, from the brink of a vast crack in the level plain, and see a vast river foaming along a half-mile below them, never to be reached. And then a year had passed, and the second began, as full of adventure and excitement as ever. But by this time, while still pursuing the phantom gold, they had learned by experience the value of keeping near Salmon River and verdant rolling plain, where bison were still plentiful, and the adventurers' larder was always well supplied. They led the life of the Indians of the plain, save that the finding of the Golden City and Temple was always kept in mind. Twice over, Griggs declared that though they had not found it, they had discovered the high road which led directly there. It was a watery way between perpendicular cliffs, and the place had been hailed for its promise of salmon, which they shot and speared as they glided in shoals over the yellow sands. It was after scooping a wounded fish from the swift waters that Chris afterwards took the tin hanging from his belt and stood knee-deep to fill the vessel with the clear, cold water fresh from the mountains. "Hand me a tinful," cried Ned, who stood aloof so as not to wet his buffalo skin boots. It was boylike. Chris filled the tin, and giving Griggs a merry look, scooped it half full of sand as well. "I say, it feels precious heavy," cried Ned, as he raised it to his lips. "Yah!" he shouted, and he was about to toss the contents back over the giver, but Griggs caught him by the arm. "I'll drink that," he said. "I'm not afraid of a little sand." He drank till the sand touched his lips, and then held it in the sunshine, looking into the tin, stooped and refilled it, and rinsed it round to pour away a mixture of sand and water, refilled again, and repeated, till nearly all the sand had gone, and then he held out the cup in triumph for the others to see a few glistening pieces of yellow metal, about as big as small, smooth, flattened shot. "Gold!" he cried. "Now then, all we have to do is follow up this river into the mountains. The Golden City is there." And they followed that river for weeks, living upon the salmon and washing for gold from time to time, and rarely without finding a few tiny nuggets, while the river grew more narrow, more rugged, more difficult of access, and drove them at last into cutting off curves and windings in the vast plain through which it flowed. But the Golden City was not there, nor anywhere else in their wanderings, which at last, from sheer necessity in the way of supplies, drew near an end. But the journey was not over yet. For the surprise of all, they dropped one day upon a large settlement, with stores and all the necessaries required by civilized man. Here they rested and recouped for a month, exciting no surprise, for prospectors were common objects there. Neither did their departure, after they had purchased all they needed, excite remark, for men came from the mountains to buy powder and blankets, and wandered off again in parties, generally with mules to bear their loads. It was like getting out of prison to be far away in the wilds again, the boys said, and then the search went on week after week, month after month, always in vain, but despair and disappointment never cast a shadow over their little camp, for it was a delightful, healthy, exciting life, with every day bringing something new, and the Golden City appearing generally in the distance after their most tiring days, when they had eaten, drunk of the crystal waters, and rolled themselves in their blankets to sleep. It was then that the Golden City came, bright and tempting, the visions of their dreams always luring them on when they rose, refreshed by their rest in the clear air of the mountains or the plain. "Oh, we're going to do it yet," Griggs would say merrily, and then they tramped to rest their ponies, and galloped when there was game afoot, and the time went on, and on, and on. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of the Peril Finders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Peril Finders by George Fenn. Chapter 55. The Old House at Home. The little mule train, very lightly laden, and with harness, pack-saddles, and loads looking ragged, patched, sun-bleached, and repaired in every conceivable way, moved slowly along through the rich greenery, led and followed by its sun-tanned escort, 3 before and 3 behind. The ponies looked in admirable condition, save that a change of diet seemed necessary to do away with the swollen-out aspect due to constant feeding upon green stuff instead of corn. But the saddles and bridles were as bad as those of the mules, though every bit and buckle glistened in the sunshine through constant rubbing with sand. The less said about the patched garments of the escort, the better. But there were no rags. Patches of divers materials, principally furry skins, were plentiful, and the moccasins, which had taken the place of boots, were either Indian and very neat, or home-made and quite the reverse. But here, too, there was something worthy of remark. Each man's weapons were admirably cared for and ready for instant use, while the occupants of the saddles, though horribly dilapidated in the way of clothes, were also in that grand state of vigorous health which also made them appear ready for immediate use in any way, from hunting or shooting to obtain the day's provision, to fighting for dear life against the enemies of the white men who roamed the plains. Not that these 6 wanderers could fairly be called white, for the sun had burned them to a dull brick red. But the term men is advisedly used, for though when the party last passed that way, going in the opposite direction, they were made up of 4 hale, vigorous men and 2 boys, the latter had been left in the desert lands through which they had been wandering for 2 years. Left, that is to say, by degrees, every bit that had been boyish having physically died out, for its place to be taken by something more manly, till on this particular day they rode back with their feet much nearer the ground, and their sturdy mustangs appearing stunted, though quite well able to carry a far heavier load than had been in the habit of climbing into the saddles when they started from the plantations at the above-named distance of time. It was only about a couple of hours before, when the party left the shelter of a patch of great spruce firs where they had camped for the night, that the doctor had made a remark to Bourne, and then both had stared hard at Chris and Ned, a proceeding which brought the blood into the young men's faces and made Chris ask what they are to laugh at. "You," said the doctor. "Why, when we rode away at our search, you looked a mere boy. You're coming back to the old home, both of you men grown, if you weren't so lathy and thin." "Nobody will know them, Wilton?" "That's for certain. They'll grin at you." "I wouldn't advise them to," said Griggs slowly. "Chris has grown very hot and peppery, and Ned here has done so much fighting that he always seems to be, as the Irish say, spoiling for another go in. So they'd better not laugh, for we want to settle down again as friends." They had been journeying on since then, getting nearer and nearer to the old settlement, but the change seemed wonderful, and they talked it over. "Why," said the doctor, "it isn't only the boys that have grown, but everything here." "Yes, wonderfully," said Bourne. "Overgrown, one ought to say." "They don't seem to have used the tracks much," put in Griggs. "It's hard work to make sure whether we're going right." "Oh, we're going right enough," said Chris. "I remember every hill and dale. Look yonder. That's where the plantations are, but how they have altered." "Yes," said the doctor, "the place does seem changed, but from the state of the tracks I'm afraid that very little has been done in the way of developing the fruit trade. Hullo! Why are you turning off here, boys?" "Because it was just under those big fir trees, father, that we took and buried that poor old prospector. Ned and I want to see the board we cut and nailed on the biggest trunk." "To be sure, yes," said Bourne. "Let's go and see." The mules were halted and began to graze, while the party rode through the lush saplings and bushes that had sprung up, so that it was hard work to get through, till they passed under the spreading branches of the trees, where the undergrowth became thin and sparse. "There's the old board!" cried Chris suddenly, and the party drew rein at last by the side of the heaped-up pile of stones with which they had marked the wanderer's grave. No one spoke for a few minutes, but they sat there thinking deeply of the old man's coming, his death, and his legacy to the doctor, who broke the silence at length with a bitter sigh. "Poor old dreamer," he said sadly, "you bequeathed us your imagination, and sent us off on our quest for the phantom gold." "Yes," said Bourne, "we'd better have left him his legacy and gone on home to the old country." "Oh, I don't know," said Wilton. "We've had a grand time of travel and adventure, eh, boys?" "Splendid," came in a breath. "I'm only sorry that we've come back." "Yes," added Chris. "You'll think that over, father, about rigging up another expedition and making a fresh trial." "We shall see," said the doctor thoughtfully. "We shall see. What do you say, Griggs, about another search for the Golden City?" "Well, I dunno," said Griggs slowly. "Maybe I'll wait a year before I decide one way or the other." "Griggs!" cried the 2 lads together. "Oh, you needn't shout," said the American. "I've been thinking over it a deal, more'n you have, p'raps. It seems to me that even if we had found the old place marked down on that old Rip Van Winkle map, we should have had a good deal of trouble to carry back enough gold to have made the journey worth while." "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed the 2 young men uproariously. "There's an old fox. He's just found out that the grapes are sour." "Well, so they have been, boys," cried the American. "But talk about grapes. It's just 5 years since I planted some fine young vines in my patch and against that shanty. I wonder whether the blights have let them grow. My word, I should like a few bunches now." "I'm afraid they'd be as sour as the gold, Griggs," said the doctor. "There, let's ride in and leave the poor old fellow to sleep in peace. He took his secret with him, for his map was too vague for us to find his city of golden dreams. We've spent 2 years over the search, but we've traveled well over an unknown land and come back, I hope, wiser and more ready to do battle with the world." "Oh, we shall try again, father," cried Chris, "and get real gold yet, not phantom gold, as you call it. Nil desperandum, you know, never say die." "Try again," cried Ned. "Hope springs eternal in the human breast," said Bourne gravely. "Better luck next time," cried Wilton. "Say, gentlemen," said Griggs dryly, "it don't seem to me a suitable time for you to be firing off your copy-book maxims all over the place when it's getting on for dinner hour. I want to progress and ride on to the old plantations to see which of our old friends is going to win in the fight to have us for guests and to give us good sitting-down square meal." "There's wisdom," cried Chris merrily. "Griggs is always right. Forward!" He led the way from beneath the spreading boughs of the great spruce, out from the solemn gloom where the old prospector lay, and into the glorious sunshine of the luxuriant, verdant country, which seemed a very Eden after the parching, sandy alkali deserts and the rocky tracts. The mules and ponies kept on snatching at a mouthful here and a mouthful there, as if it were too rich and tempting to be passed up. But in spite of all the loveliness around, the adventurers became more and more impressed by a something desolate about the attractive district over which they passed. The hills and dales were glorious, but somehow they came upon no signs of cultivation, nor yet of settlements, till at last, with a feeling of sinking that was not all due to hunger, they rode right into the very center of the cluster of plantations they had left 2 years before on their search for the Golden City, to find on their return, wherever they went, traces of a fire here, completely overrun with greenery, there the remains of a shed or a shanty with trees and vines dislodging the props and boards. And though they hailed and whistled, it was only to scare birds or squirrels, and to awake no answering call. They rode a little here and a little there, the ponies pushing their way through the tremendous growth, but it was all the same. Shanty after shanty was in ruins where it could be traced, but desertion everywhere. But during the search, moved by a strange feeling of opposition, the friends shrank from approaching the dense grove which hid the home they had left. They all shared the feeling that it would be too painful to look upon the traces of the fire that without doubt had leveled with the soil the house they had toiled over, and it was not until Griggs spoke that something like a spell which had hung over them was driven away. "Seems to me," he said, "that when the fellows burned or carried off all their stuff, they made a pretty clean sweep. I'm just going across now to have a look at my old spot, but I don't suppose there'll be any dinner waiting there. Won't you have a look at your old roost first?" "Yes," said the doctor, making an effort. "I couldn't go on yonder before. Chris, old boy, there's no one to blame but ourselves. We deserted the old place, but it seemed to be hard to bear. Let's look at the ruins, if there are any left." They forced their way through a dense grove of fruit trees and wild growth, which towered above the plantings of the past, the ponies breaking down the lush vines and succulent canes, till they were brought up suddenly by something solid which was overgrown by a vine. "What?" cried the doctor. "Ahoy, Griggy!" roared Chris through his hands. "Ahoy! Hooray! Here's one of our vines loaded and breaking down with grapes." The next minute the American and his companions had forced their way up to the front of the big shanty and its shed, the barracks as they had termed it, to find that their fellow settlers had respected the nailed-up doors and shutters, leaving at their exodus the unlucky district just as it had been at the Peril finder's departure. But nature had been hard at work for her part, toiling as she toils in a rich country to destroy man's work and restore all to its pristine state. But though vines had draped and shoots had dislodged shingles, the stoutly nailed walls stood firm. No firebrand had been set to the sawn-up wood, and after some work with an axe to wrench away the boards that had been nailed over window, shutter, and door, there was the old place, fairly intact, with the utensils just as they had been left. The consequence was that the wanderers, after seeing to their weary beasts and leaving them grazing in the midst of abundance, made their own dinner seated at the rough table, drinking the water from the swift river hard by, and finding, half smothered by the competing growth, abundance of peaches and Bartlett pears to supplement the grapes ripening on the roof of the old home. "I say, Chris," said Ned, with his mouth full, or nearly so, of juicy pear, "is this all a dream?" "My peach tastes just like a real one," was the reply. "But I say, father, the fruit never used to grow like this." "No, my boy," said the doctor. "I feel half stunned in my surprise. A complete change seems to have come over everything. The weeds and wild things have run rampant, but the fruit trees, such as I can see, all look clean and free from blight." "Say, neighbor," cried Griggs, "I'm going over to my place now, if someone else will help at the clearance. These grapes, you know." "They're splendid," said the doctor. "What about them?" "Why, this," said Griggs. "I planted lots, and they'd never grow any more than my oranges would." "Oranges!" cried Chris. "Here, father, we haven't looked at our grove." "Come on with me, then," said Griggs, "and we'll take it on the way. I want to see mine, too. As to the grapes, if yours will grow like this, so ought mine. And if they have, but wait a bit." All mounted again to make their mustangs breast their way in the direction of the dried-up peach and orange grove which they had toiled over in despair, and at the first glance a shout of delight arose. "Why, father," cried Chris, "what was the good of going there through thirst and starvation to find phantom gold, when it is glowing and growing and breaking down the branches here?" For it was a golden sight indeed for weary, longing, and disappointed eyes. Progress was difficult after they had literally gloated over the beauty and promise of the orange grove, for the tracks were wonderfully grown over, everything showing that the settlement must have been forsaken almost directly after the departure of the adventurers. Then Griggs' plantation was reached, and found to be as full of promise as that which they had so lately quitted, and this proved to be the case wherever they rode, for the change everywhere was complete, the crops, as far as the encroaching wildings would allow, being abundant, but not a hand left to gather, those whom the party had known having forsaken the place to a man. The rest of the day was devoted to cleaning and making the old home suitable for temporary, if not for permanent, habitation. Creeper and vine had to be cut back so as to admit light and clear the choked-up chimney, while the growth, endless intruders, insect, reptile, and bird, were banished. The remaining stores, now very low, were brought in, and what all declared to be a very jovial supper prepared and most thoroughly enjoyed. "One never knows what a day will bring," cried Bourne, smiling upon his listeners. "Here we were this morning, weary and despondent, looking forward to someone taking us in tonight by way of charity, while now we find that we have fallen on our feet and are quite at home in the midst of abundance." "Yes," said Wilton, "I've seen enough to prove that nature has retaken possession here, and that an hour with a gun will give us all we want tomorrow in the way of game." "Yes," cried Chris, "and look there, Ned, fish." "What about them?" "The river's full, and I saw plenty leaping, waiting for rod and line or net." "That's good," cried Ned. "Oh, yes, we shan't starve," said Griggs. "But let's see, how far used we to be from the other settlement?" 40 miles, replied the doctor. "But suppose that is deserted the same as this? Then we shall be quite 100 from the next." 100, said Griggs dryly. "Well, that seems horribly close and crowding one up, like after living as we've been lately. It seems to me that if we like to stop here now, we might have the pick of the whole place, and as many patches as we like to take up." "What about the old owners?" said Bourne. "They've thrown up the game and gone. Back to England, perhaps. I don't believe anyone is ever likely to put in claims, but we could soon get that settled by the state law. I've nearly made up my mind to start afresh, doctor. You see, everything is going to be quite different, but there's one thing I can't understand. Climates don't change all at once. But here this place is boiling over, as one might say, with plenty now, while a few years ago we were only able to grow enough to feed the insects and blight. How do you account for that?" "I can only give you what I surmise to be the case," replied the doctor. "We were tempted here by seeing how beautiful and fruitful everything was. Yes, everything but what we planted, and that tried to die out of the way as fast as it could. Well, sir, how about that? Simply because the things we planted were strange to the land. All they wanted was time. years in which to root down to the best soil. If we had waited longer, they would have appeared as good as they are now." "That sounds well, sir," said Griggs, "and I should like to hear a little more about it. But I think we've got as much to think about as we can bear to-night. What say you?" "That I shall be thankful for a good night's rest," was the reply, and soon after all was silent within the lonely ranch, both the lads lying listening to the varied sounds without, for to one of them it seemed as if all the wild creatures of the forest were holding a meeting to inquire into the fresh invasion of a tract of land out of which they had been driven years before, but to which they had returned upon its being deserted, while now the question was in respect of a new invasion, and whether those who had taken possession intended to stay. End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of the Peril Finders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Peril Finders by George Fenn. Chapter 56. Like to go again? Chris Lee had the impression next morning that he had lain for hours listening to the strange cries of wild creatures which had once more made the plantations their home, and he smiled at the idea that had come to him respecting a meeting when he rose from the blanket and saddle-bed upon which he had slept better than he remembered ever to have done in his life. His first look was at the place Ned had occupied, but he was already gone, and upon hurrying out he came upon him just visible as he forced his way through the tall growth, with an orange in each hand and a half-dozen tucked into his breast. "Good morning," he shouted. "I've been down to the river. It seems full of fish." "That's good news," cried Chris, "isn't it? But look here, there'll be a long talk over breakfast this morning about— Seen Griggs?" "No, but why will they talk about him over breakfast?" "Stuff! I didn't mean that. He came to the river with me, and he's gone now to light a fire and boil the kettle. He wants to talk to you as he did to me." "What about?" "What about? Why, about this place. He's red hot over it, and says it would be madness to go away now and give up real gold for what may after all be nothing better than a dream. What do you think?" "I?" said Chris, laughing. "That I've had enough fighting and tramping to last me for many years to come." "Then if I say I'll stay, will you?" "I don't know yet," said Chris. "What? Why, you're never going to run back." "I'm not going to run back, nor run forward," replied Chris. "I'm going to do just what my father does, and in spite of your talk, I believe you'll stand by Mr. Bourne." "Of course," cried Ned, "but he's sure to say he'll stay. There's only your father and Wilton on the other side, so we shall be 4-2 if you'll stand by me. Now, what do you say?" "Nothing at present. Let's wait." Ned pressed for a definite promise, but Chris remained firm and went to help Griggs in his preparation of the first breakfast that had been eaten upon the old hearth for 2 years. It was rough, but appetite would have made up for that, only it seemed wanting, and the steaming coffee and the tough, damper bread remained almost untasted for a time, everyone being thoughtful and silent. At last the doctor spoke. "Look here," he said, "I've got something upon my mind, and judging from your looks, it seems to me that every one is not only troubled in the same way, but eager to get that something off. Am I right in coming to the conclusion that you're all thinking of the same thing?" "I guess I am," said Griggs. "I'm sure I am," said Bourne. "I'm thinking that the sooner we get to work, the better," said Wilton. "That's soon settled, then," said the doctor, "for there is no occasion to ask the boys. It's written plainly in both their faces. We all think that it would be madness to talk of leaving such a home as we can make of this." "All!" came in chorus, and then the appetite for breakfast, while they worked afterwards as they had never worked before to master and drive back the encroaching forest, fetch stores with their mule train from the distant port, rebuild and restore, and in due time plant, gather, and farm to provide the necessaries of life, till Golden Hollow, as it was renamed, became a veritable Eden, a home which attracted others, till as time went on the Peril Finders struggled to grasp at the phantom gold seemed to grow more and more like some exciting dream. "Ever think of the shooting now, boys?" said Griggs one day, as he stood by the side of the great green basket of fruit he had gathered and just set down, to turn over some half a dozen that were beginning to glow like gold. "Not often," said Ned, "but it will come at times." "Do you?" said Griggs, turning to Chris, who looked thoughtful. "Yes, I did only yesterday," was the reply. "I was at the bottom of the big peach orchard when I regularly jumped, for there was a sharp whiz close to my ear, and I began to think of the Indians hiding behind every bush." "But it couldn't have been an arrow," cried Griggs. "No, only a hawk making a dash at one of those blue-breasted birds, but it set me thinking of arrows flying, and using one's rifle, too." "Ah, rough times those," said Griggs, picking up 2 oranges, and then a third, to keep them juggler fashion, following one another through the air. "Like to go again?" "No!" shouted Chris and Ned together, in a way which disconcerted the juggler, so that the oranges all came down, to be picked up quickly, as the American said sharply, "Same here. Once was enough." End of chapter 56, and The End of the Peril Finders by George Fenn.